It was February 6th, 1999, the kind of Colorado night that swallowed sound. The wind off the Flatirons was sharp, snow tracing the outlines of every street lamp, every mailbox, every lost thing. 18-year-old Diane Mercer, a senior at Boulder Ridge High, had stayed late after a theater rehearsal. She called her mother, Janet, around 9:42 p.m. "I'm on my way," she said, her voice tired, warm, confident. That call was the last anyone ever heard from her. The next morning, her car was found just 2 blocks from home, engine off, door unlocked, her backpack still on the passenger seat. One of her shoes lay in the snow a few yards away, half buried, as though dropped mid-step. No sign of struggle, no sign of Diane, just silence. Her parents spent the first day thinking she might have gone to a friend's, the second day praying she'd call. By the third, they were standing outside their house as search parties fanned out into the dark woods west of town, volunteers clutching flashlights that cut through nothing but fog. For weeks, Boulder Ridge became a town that didn't sleep. Flyers plastered to telephone poles, candlelight vigils on the high school steps, reporters at every intersection. The police worked every angle, boyfriends, strangers, drifters, but every lead ended the same way in the cold. By spring, the case file thickened, but hope thinned. Janet Mercer's face became a symbol of quiet heartbreak, the mother who refused to take down her daughter's photos from the living room wall. Every night, she'd leave the porch light burning, whispering through the open window, "Come home, baby. Please, come home." No one came. And as the years passed, people started to move on. The news stopped talking about it. The flyers faded in the rain. The neighbors changed. But in one house, on one quiet street, that light never went out. The town thought they'd seen the last of Diane Mercer's story. They were wrong. It was just beginning. Have you ever trusted your community so completely that you forgot danger doesn't always wear a mask? She thought she was safe 2 blocks from home. She wasn't. The next time someone vanishes near you, will you see it coming? Subscribe now, because stories like this remind us evil hides where comfort lives. By the end of that first week, Boulder Ridge wasn't just scared, it was breaking apart. Police cars lined the street where Diane's car had been found, reporters pushing microphones into the frozen wind, neighbors standing behind their curtains, whispering names they'd once spoken with kindness. Every parent held their child tighter. Every stranger looked like a suspect. The search widened, helicopters scanned the foothills, divers searched the frozen creek beds, and volunteers dragged the forest trails mile by mile. But there was nothing, no body, no evidence. Just a single trail of footprints leading away from her car that stopped halfway across the road as if she'd vanished into the air. Inside the Mercer home, grief didn't come quietly. Janet stopped sleeping. Her husband, Robert, paced the hallway at night, replaying every second of that last phone call, the one where she promised she'd be home soon. "Maybe I should have gone to get her," he said. "Maybe she wouldn't." His voice would trail off, unfinished, because no sentence could hold the weight of what-ifs. When the police came knocking again, it wasn't for answers. It was for alibis. They questioned friends, classmates, even the theater director, a respected teacher named Alistair Finch. He'd been the last adult to see Diane that night. He said she left rehearsal early, around 9:30. His story never changed. His voice never wavered. And the police, under pressure to calm a terrified town, moved on. Days turned into weeks. The vigils turned into silence. By the 3rd month, the town started to look the other way. They had jobs, kids, graduations to attend. And in small towns, silence can become mercy. Pretending not to know becomes survival. But for Janet Mercer, time was a thief. Every morning, she'd drive the same road Diane disappeared on. She'd pull over, sit in her car, and whisper, "If you're out there, just tell me how to find you." One spring afternoon, she parked near the old bridge and stared at the water. The reflection of her daughter's missing flyer fluttered in the current. She reached for it, trembling. For the first time, she realized something cruel. The world had already moved on. The only one still searching was her. What would you do if the whole world stopped looking, but you couldn't stop? Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The investigation began before sunrise. The air was so cold that the officers' breath looked like smoke as they swept through alleyways and drainage ditches with flashlights. Every officer on duty that week was pulled in. Boulder Ridge wasn't used to this kind of case, not one that gripped the whole town by its throat. Detective Harold Klein was put in charge. He was seasoned, patient, but stretched thin, juggling too many cases, too little time, and too much pressure from the mayor's office to show progress. His partner, Laura Benton, fresh-faced but fierce, ran logistics out of the station, piecing together timelines that kept changing by the hour. They followed every rumor like it might be the one that would bring Diane home. Witness statements came in by the dozens, and no two ever matched. One woman swore she saw a red SUV speeding down Sycamore Street the night Diane disappeared. Another insisted it was a campus maintenance worker who'd been acting strange. A student claimed Diane was arguing with someone, maybe a jealous classmate, maybe a stranger. Every lead had a new name, a new face, a new theory, and every one of them collapsed. When the press got hold of it, the story took on a life of its own. Reporters hounded the Mercers for interviews, tabloids twisted timelines, and nightly news anchors speculated about Diane's personal life. Troubled student, one headline read. Secret romance, another whispered. Each lie chipped away at her humanity, turning her from a daughter into a rumor. The town's fear became fuel for gossip. At the grocery store, whispers started about who could have done it. At the diner, old men argued about whether she'd run away. It was easier to believe she'd left on her own than to face what they were all too afraid to say, that someone they knew might have taken her. Klein's office walls filled with photos, maps, and timelines. The case file thickened but stayed hollow. He called the search a carousel of ghosts, names spinning around, but none staying long enough to catch. He looked exhausted, and every time the phone rang, his expression said he already knew it wasn't going to be good news. Meanwhile, the university administration called for calm. They issued statements about student safety protocols and community unity, but everyone in the department knew the truth. They wanted this story buried. Bad publicity meant fewer enrollments, fewer donations. And when money started talking, the police started listening. By the third month, the search had slowed to a crawl. Funding for extended overtime was cut. The volunteers thinned out. The media moved on to the next headline. And Boulder Ridge, once electric with fear, became numb. At home, Janet Mercer refused to believe it was over. She turned her dining room into a command center. Maps, notes, and police photos covering every inch. Her husband stopped trying to stop her. If the world forgets, she said quietly one night, then she really is gone. Were said Ben with Sedgwick Tower. But in truth, the forgetting had already begun. The case had turned cold. The police packed the evidence into a brown box and labeled it Case Number B, R99247. Klein closed the file with a sigh, whispering, "We'll find her someday." But he didn't believe it anymore. Would you keep searching if the people sworn to protect you gave up? By summer of 1999, the Mercer case wasn't an investigation anymore. It was a battle of blame. Boulder Ridge wanted closure, not truth. And truth doesn't move fast enough for politics. Detective Harold Klein stood in front of reporters one last time, giving the same hollow statement he'd repeated for months. "We are following every lead." Behind him, the mayor and university officials nodded like they were in control. But inside the precinct, Klein knew the truth. The case was collapsing. Key evidence had gone missing. One of Diane's gloves, recovered near her car, had been misplaced during transfer to the state lab. Chain of custody forms were unsigned. DNA testing, still new and expensive in the late 90s, was deemed unnecessary at this stage. The file was already thinning, page by page, under the weight of bureaucracy and fear. Detective Laura Benton fought to keep it alive. "We can't close this. she told her captain, slamming the report onto his desk. "We have one missing girl, one grieving family, and a town that's pretending she never existed." But the captain only looked tired. "Laura," he said, "we can't fight City Hall and the university at the same time." The moment she left his office, the order came down. All leads to be deprioritized, pending new information. Translation: stop digging. And so, they did. The final straw came when the university's board quietly reached out to the Mercer family. They offered to rename a scholarship in Diane's honor. A lasting tribute, they called it. Janet refused. "She's not a headline," she told them through tears. "She's my child." The town took that as a sign it was time to move on. People wanted normal again: concerts, summer fairs, Friday night games. But one person refused to let the silence settle. Carla Langford, Diane's closest friend, started her own search. While the police boxed their files, Carla printed flyers and mailed them to every campus in the state. She canvassed hiking trails, abandoned rest stops, even truck stops along I-70. Every night, she called Janet to update her, her voice steady, even when her hands shook. "We're going to find her," she'd promise, "even if I have to be the last one looking." Her persistence made her a local target. People whispered that she was obsessed, that she couldn't move on. But what they didn't understand was this: grief doesn't always sit quietly. Sometimes it claws. When autumn came, the case was officially listed as inactive. Klein packed up his desk, staring at the worn photograph of Diane pinned to the board one last time. He muttered to Benton, "She deserved better than this." "Yeah," Benton said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "They all do." The evidence box was sealed, stamped, and stored in the police archives, a graveyard of forgotten stories. The case file closed. The parents didn't. Would you keep searching if the people sworn to protect you gave up? By 2000, the town of Boulder Ridge had started pretending again. Pretending the posters had been taken down because of the rain. Pretending the empty chair in the Mercer home wasn't still waiting at the dinner table. Pretending that safety had returned. But no one could quite shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the air itself had grown quieter. The case became a story people told in passing. The library girl, they called her. New students whispered about her at parties, like she was a ghost that haunted the edge of campus. Teachers told the story during safety seminars, their voices clinical, rehearsed, stripped of the human ache that once filled it. For most, Diane Mercer became an urban legend, not a daughter, not a friend, just a cautionary tale for freshmen walking home too late. But Carla Langford never forgot. Every February, on Diane's birthday, she sent a letter to the Boulder Police Department. The first few got responses. "Thank you for your concern, Miss Langford. The investigation remains open." But after 2005, they stopped replying. Still, she sent them anyway. By 2010, Carla had moved to Denver. She worked at a library downtown, surrounded by rows of forgotten stories. On her breaks, she'd open her laptop and read through old news archives, names, dates, statements. She built her own timeline, her own evidence board, her own quiet crusade. Once a year, she returned to Boulder Ridge to visit Janet Mercer. The two women sat on the porch, drinking lukewarm coffee, staring down the same road Diane never made it down. "They all moved on," Janet would whisper. "They forgot her name." Carla would smile sadly. "Then we'll say it louder." Meanwhile, the rest of Boulder Ridge changed. The university expanded, the coffee shops filled with new faces, and the old diner where the search teams used to gather was torn down. The only thing that didn't change was the wind, the same dry whisper that swept through the alleys at night, the same hum that felt like a memory refusing to fade. No one noticed the man who still attended every memorial vigil. He always stood at the back, head bowed, quiet, carrying flowers. Professor Alistair Finch had built a new reputation, a grieving teacher, a voice for emotional healing. He wrote a book called After the Silence, a memoir about the loss of his student, and it sold thousands of copies. He gave lectures at universities about recovery, about forgiveness, about letting go. People applauded him for his empathy. They called him an example of resilience. Only Carla found it strange that the man who claimed to be haunted by the past never once spoke to Diane's mother. And yet, his name was untouchable. He was respected, beloved, quoted in psychology courses, invited to conferences. He built his life on her absence. No one saw the irony, not yet. Have you ever seen someone turn another person's pain into their success story? Detective Harold Klein retired in 2008. Though retired wasn't the right word. He left the department, but the Mercer case never left him. His desk at home was cluttered with old notes, copied reports, and yellowing photographs, the same ones he'd stared at for years, hoping for something he'd missed. His wife once told him to throw it all out, to stop torturing himself. He just shook his head. I made her mother a promise. Every spring, he drove the stretch of road where Diane's car had been found. He'd park near the bridge, leave a single rose on the guardrail, and sit in silence until the sun set. Sometimes, he talked out loud to the air, to her, to whatever part of the universe might still be listening. I'm sorry, he'd whisper. We failed you. He wasn't wrong. The file had been sealed, the town had moved on, and the new generation barely knew the name Diane Mercer. Only Carla still spoke it. She sent updates to the local news every few years, hoping someone would listen. They never did. Her messages went unanswered, buried under new headlines and newer tragedies. By 2015, even Janet Mercer had stopped hoping. Age had made her small, frail, quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after years of screaming into walls. When Carla visited, she would find her sitting by the window, the porch light still on in the middle of the day. Maybe she's somewhere better, Janet said once, her voice soft, cracked. Carla's throat tightened. She deserved better here. It was around that same year that Professor Finch, now nationally known, published his second book, The Human Spirit. It was a bestseller. In it, he described his lifelong grief over the disappearance of his student, his struggle with survivor's guilt, and the transformative power of forgiveness. The irony was thick enough to choke on. But no one questioned him. They didn't see the man behind the carefully chosen words. They saw the grief, the humility, the performance. Klein read that book one night. He threw it into the fireplace before finishing the first chapter. But time has a way of circling back. In 2021, a new cold case division was established in Denver, funded by grants, run by younger detectives who grew up with the technology their predecessors never had. Boxes from across the state were pulled from evidence vaults, re-examined, digitized, and logged. Among them was a cardboard container, label faded but still legible. Case number B, R99247, Mercer, D. A young analyst paused before moving it to the archive shelf. What's this one? She asked. Her supervisor glanced over the lid. Oh, Boulder Ridge. College girl, 1999. Never solved. The analyst hesitated, her fingers brushing over the box tape. She noticed something odd, a faint stain on the top corner, a discoloration that shouldn't have been there. What if we run it through the new database? She asked. Her supervisor shrugged. We've got hundreds to process. But she set it aside anyway. It would take one more week, one more late-night shift, and one more spark of curiosity for that forgotten evidence to open its mouth and speak again. For 22 years, the truth sat quietly inside an evidence bag, waiting for someone brave enough to open it. Do you believe time erases the truth, or just waits for the right person to find it? For 20 years, a killer lived among students, praised and trusted. If evil can wear a kind smile, what's hiding near you? Subscribe. Stay aware. Stay alive. 2 decades after the Mercer case had faded into folklore, the Denver Cold Case Unit came alive again. A small office filled with computers, coffee cups, and the low hum of machines doing what human memory had failed to do. At its center was Detective Naomi Price, a woman known for her quiet resolve and relentless focus. She wasn't a storyteller like her predecessors. She was a scientist of truth. The Mercer box came to her by chance. It was supposed to be filed away permanently, one of hundreds pulled from the vault for digitization. The label was nearly unreadable, scrawled in fading ink. ML 1999. No one on the team recognized the initials. When the clerk brought it to her desk, Price dusted off the lid and frowned. "Mercer, Diane," she whispered, scanning the file tag. 22 years cold. Inside the box was the ghost of a forgotten investigation. A cracked evidence bag, a cassette tape of old interviews, and a sealed brown envelope marked "Fiber Vehicle Seat." She held it under the light, a faded strip of fabric, deep blue, frayed at the edges. A scarf, the same one Diane's mother had described in her last interview before the case went silent. What caught Price's attention wasn't the scarf itself, but the faint discoloration on the corner barely visible, a rusty smudge that had never been tested. She pulled the report attached to it. The notes were brief, careless. Sample too small for analysis. 2,000 standards inadequate for DNA trace. Her pen tapped against the paper as her eyes narrowed. Technology had moved forward by decades since that line was written. With forensic-grade genome sequencing, she could now work with skin cells invisible to the naked eye. She looked at the scarf again. "You've been waiting a long time," she muttered. Within an hour, she had it logged, labeled, and queued for testing at the state forensic lab. When her supervisor asked why she was spending lab resources on an old ghost case, she simply said, "Because ghosts don't kill people. Someone real did." Days turned into weeks as the sample processed. Price barely slept, running other cases while keeping a close eye on the Mercer submission. She reread the file nightly, each page a reminder of how many people had walked away from this girl's story. The phone rang just after midnight on a Tuesday. The voice on the other end belonged to the lab director. His tone was calm and being careful. "Detective Price, the Mercer test came back. We found something." She sat up. "A match?" "Not a direct one," he said. "A partial familial link. One living relative on record." Her pulse quickened. "Who?" The man hesitated. "Daniel Wright, age 46, Boulder County. Listed as next of kin to an Evan Wright." She froze. Her mind clicked through the reports, the old newspaper clippings, the interviews. Evan Wright, Diane's former professor, her mentor, her alibi. It wasn't possible. But DNA didn't lie. Would you want science to expose a truth your community swore wasn't real? Detective Naomi Price didn't sleep that night. She sat at her desk long after the rest of the unit had gone home, surrounded by the hum of machines and the whisper of papers shifting under the air vents. The name Daniel Wright glowed on her monitor like a warning light, not a suspect, but a bloodline. DNA didn't always hand you the culprit. Sometimes it pointed to the family tree that grew around them. She started tracing backward. Daniel's records led her to Evan Wright, uncle, now 63, retired literature professor, nationally recognized for his books on grief, healing, and emotional resilience. The irony was almost too cruel to process. The deeper she looked, the clearer the timeline became. Evan had been Diane Mercer's professor in 1999, her mentor, her reference for college recommendations, the man quoted in every newspaper interview during the first investigation. He'd comforted her parents, helped lead the volunteer searches, and publicly condemned the police when they closed the case. He'd built his legacy on her disappearance. Price pulled up his lecture schedules, campus logs, and media appearances. He'd been in Boulder the night she vanished. His timeline, never verified, never challenged, had slipped by unnoticed because no one wanted to accuse the man who'd become the face of compassion. A chill moved through her as she whispered to herself, he was right there. The next morning, she reopened the Mercer file under new classification. Active DNA link confirmed. She didn't tell the department head immediately. She'd seen what happened when old names from respected families showed up in reports. Instead, she requested access to the university archives and began quietly rebuilding the original 1999 case. She listened to every recorded interview again, every voice echoing across time. When Evan spoke, his tone was calm, rehearsed. "She was a wonderful student," he said. "Always curious, always kind. I just hope she's found peace." Peace. The word struck her like a knife. In her notes, she circled the phrase 3 times, pressing hard enough for the pen to tear through the paper. By noon, she was standing in front of her superior's door, the evidence folder under her arm. When he looked up, she placed it on his desk. "What is this?" he asked. "Proof," she said simply. "Proof we've been living with a lie for 23 years. He flipped through the pages, the DNA report, the genealogy map, the photo of a smiling, silver-haired Evan Wright signing copies of his book After the Silence. He exhaled slowly. "Naomi, do you know what this means?" She nodded. "It means the file that everyone forgot has just remembered itself." "Would you still believe in heroes if one of them was built on a lie?" Detective Naomi Price didn't alert the media, not the department, not even her own team when she began surveillance. You don't shout into a house made of glass. You listen. You wait for the cracks to show. For 3 weeks, she watched Evan Wright from a distance, the man the world believed was the embodiment of empathy. His schedule was routine, as if scripted. Morning walk through downtown Boulder, lunch at the same cafe on Walnut Street, afternoons spent signing copies of his latest book, The Human Spirit Revisited. He shook hands with strangers, offered soft smiles, and left generous tips. The kind of man who made you feel safe by standing next to him. But Price wasn't fooled by charm. She'd seen what the truth looked like when it wore a kind face. On the 4th day, she made her move. She sat 2 tables away at the cafe, sipping coffee while her plainclothes partner, Agent Marcus Holt, handled the subtle task of opportunity. When Wright stood to leave, he tossed his paper cup in the bin and stepped out into the cold. Holt waited 30 seconds before casually retrieving it, sealing it in an evidence bag. It looked like nothing. A cup, a fingerprint smudge, a sip of arrogance left behind. By midnight, the sample was in the lab. 2 days later, the results came back. The report was short. Match confirmed. 100% identical to DNA recovered from Scarf ML 1999. Price read it twice. Her chest tightened, not in triumph, but disbelief. 23 years of silence, shattered in 2 lines of text. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. "You've got to be kidding me." When she called Carla Langford to tell her, there was a long pause on the other end. Carla's breath hitched, breaking under the weight of something between fury and nausea. "Evan Wright?" she whispered. "He helped us print the flyers. He sat in our kitchen. I fed him dinner while he looked me in the eye." Price said nothing. What could she say? There were no words for that kind of betrayal. The next morning, she stood outside Wright's lecture hall, watching him through the window as he spoke to a crowd of students. His voice carried warmth, sincerity, even hope. "We heal by remembering," he told them. "We become stronger through our losses." Price felt the irony twist in her stomach. He wasn't teaching them healing. He was performing it. What if the man who comforted the grieving was the one who created their grief? The news didn't leak, it detonated. At 7:42 a.m. on March 19, 2022, Boulder Ridge woke to headlines that ripped through every screen, every phone, every front porch. Beloved professor linked to 1999 disappearance DNA match confirmed. By noon, camera crews were parked outside Evan Wright's gated home. His neighbors watched from behind blinds as police cruisers lined the street. Reporters shouted questions through the fence. "Mr. Wright, do you have anything to say to the Mercer family? Did you really use your student's death to sell your books?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence said enough. Within hours, his publisher suspended all pending releases. Speaking engagements vanished. The university erased his name from their faculty page. His life, his image, disintegrated in real time. But for Carla Langford, the collapse wasn't fast enough. She watched the coverage from her kitchen table, her hands trembling against a mug of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. She whispered the same sentence over and over. He hugged Janet. He held her hand. He told her he'd pray for Diane. There's a particular cruelty in learning that kindness can be camouflage. Detective Naomi Price stayed off camera. She refused interviews, refused praise, refused distraction. The job isn't done, she told her team. We don't celebrate, we confirm. When the warrant came through, Price led the search herself. The officers found boxes of old journals, correspondence, lecture notes. But one drawer in Wright's study stopped them all. Inside were neatly folded newspaper clippings from 1999, each one about Diane Mercer. Press photos, missing posters, her senior portrait laminated and preserved. At the bottom of the drawer was something smaller, a photo from one of the volunteer searches, Diane's parents standing shoulder to shoulder with the very man who'd taken their daughter. The edges of the photo were worn smooth, as if touched too many times. Price stared at it, her throat tightening. He kept them close, she said quietly, all of them. By the time Wright was escorted out of his home in handcuffs, the crowd outside had grown to hundreds. Students, colleagues, strangers, all watching the man they'd once called mentor shuffle down his driveway with his head bowed. Some shouted curses. Others stood in stunned silence. The man who wrote about grief now embodied it. When the footage aired that evening, the entire state watched in disbelief. The captions read simply, "Arrest made cold case reopened after 23 years." But for the Mercer family, this wasn't closure. It was confirmation of a nightmare they'd already lived through once. Janet Mercer passed away in 2017, 5 years too early to hear the truth she had begged for. Carla stood at her grave that night, phone in hand, watching the broadcast again and again. The glow from the screen lit her tear-streaked face. "He wrote books about grief," she whispered through clenched teeth. Every page was a confession he never intended to make. The air was still when they arrived. Snow dusted the trees, the kind that muffles sound and swallows breath. It was 6:12 a.m., the hour between night and day, when the world hasn't yet decided what it wants to be. Detective Naomi Price stood outside the cabin, watching her team fan out silently through the pines. Every crunch of their boots felt like it carried 23 years of weight. Through the frosted window, she could see Evan Wright sitting at a wooden desk, a mug of tea steaming beside him. He wasn't writing, just staring, hands folded, as if he'd been expecting them. When the knock came, he didn't flinch. "Mr. Wright," Price called through the door, her tone level, deliberate. "We have a warrant." He rose, adjusted his glasses, and opened the door like a man greeting an old friend. The calm in his voice was eerie. "I was wondering when you'd come," he said. "You found it, didn't you?" He didn't resist. He didn't argue. He simply turned and held out his wrists, waiting for the cuffs. The team hesitated for a moment, not out of fear, but disbelief. This was the man who'd preached healing, who'd stood on television stages speaking about empathy and grief. And now, he stood in the doorway of a cabin, surrounded by snow, looking almost relieved. Inside, the cabin was quiet, lined with books and newspaper stacks, an archive of his life's deception. The fireplace still burned low, the air thick with smoke and cedar. On the mantel were framed photographs of his lectures, his awards, and one picture that froze every officer in the room, a volunteer search photo from 1999. Diane Mercer's parents standing beside Wright, their faces tired but hopeful, his arm resting gently on Janet's shoulder. "Start documenting," Price ordered softly. The search turned the cabin into a crime scene. Beneath a loose floorboard near the desk, they found a small metal box, rusted but intact. Inside was a silver bracelet engraved with the initials D.M. Next to it, a bundle of newspaper clippings, Polaroids of candlelight vigils, and a folded map marked with a single red X, deep in the Flatirons foothills. Wright sat by the table as they cataloged every item. He didn't ask questions. He didn't look at the evidence. When Price finally approached him, he lifted his eyes calm, almost kind. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he said quietly. We argued. She wanted to leave. I just wanted to help her understand. Price's hand tightened on her notepad. Understand what? He smiled faintly. That good intentions can be misunderstood. It was a sentence designed to sound poetic, but all she heard was control. The confession was partial, fragmented, wrapped in the same self-importance that had protected him for years. He described the night as a mistake, an argument by her car, a moment of panic, and then silence. He claimed he buried her so she could rest near the place she loved. The team stared at him in disbelief. The place she loved? He was referring to the foothills, the very trails where he'd taught poetry classes for years, where he'd taken students to find their voice. Now, they knew what else he'd buried there. Price stepped outside, exhaling into the freezing air. The wind carried the scent of pine and something colder, a truth that had waited too long to breathe. The mountains, she murmured, glancing toward the distant peaks, have been keeping her secret. But not anymore. It took 2 hours to reach the spot marked on Wright's map. The sun had just started to break through the gray sky when the convoy of vehicles wound up the narrow mountain trail. The world felt heavier there, the kind of silence that didn't invite peace, only reverence. Detective Naomi Price stepped out first, her boots sinking into the snow-packed dirt. The trees stood motionless, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. For years, hikers had passed through this trail without knowing what rested just beyond it. Now, with the map's red X guiding them, they knew where to look. The search team spread out, scanning the slope with metal probes and thermal sensors. It didn't take long. Beneath a cluster of aspens, one officer called out softly, not with triumph, but with sorrow. "Detective, we found her." Price approached slowly. The earth had shifted over the years, the grave shallow but undisturbed. The excavation was done gently, each layer of soil lifted as though time itself might shatter if handled too harshly. The first thing they uncovered was the corner of blue fabric Diane's scarf, faded but unmistakable. A hush fell over the team. No words, no applause. Just the quiet realization that they were standing in the presence of the ending everyone had been searching for. Price knelt by the grave, brushing snow from the fabric. "You waited long enough," she whispered. Hours later, the remains were transported under full escort, covered by the Colorado state flag. For the first time in 23 years, the Mercer family name was spoken over police radio frequencies. Again, not as a mystery, but as justice finally breathing. When Carla Langford arrived at the site that afternoon, she stood beside Detective Price, her eyes glassy but steady. The wind tugged at her scarf, carrying her breath into the cold air. "I thought I'd feel better," Carla said softly, "but it just hurts different." Price nodded. "Closure isn't peace, it's just proof." Carla glanced toward the clearing. "He came up here all these years. He taught his classes right above her grave." "Monsters hide best where no one thinks to look," Price said. He wanted to be close to his secret. The forensic team worked in silence as the last of the evidence was collected. Cameras clicked, notes were taken, bags sealed. But for everyone present, it wasn't just procedure. It was a burial done twice, one by a killer, one by the truth. Before leaving, Price placed Diane's recovered silver bracelet on a nearby branch. The initials D, M, caught the light of the setting sun. "She gets the view now," she said quietly. As the convoy began its descent, the clouds rolled back, revealing the full sweep of the mountains. For years, they'd guarded the truth, like stone sentinels silent, unmoved. Now, they stood witness to its release. The mountains had held her secret long enough. He looked like the perfect mentor, but monsters don't always hide in darkness. Subscribe before the next truth surfaces. Too late. The trial of Evan Wright began on a cold January morning in 2023, the kind of morning that felt too quiet for what was about to unfold. The courthouse in downtown Denver was packed before the doors opened. Reporters, old students, families from Boulder Ridge, everyone came to see the man who'd built his reputation on empathy face the weight of his own deceit. He entered the courtroom wearing a gray suit, clean-shaven, calm. His expression didn't carry shame or defiance, only a kind of weary calculation, as if he'd rehearsed this role too. Cameras clicked as he took his seat beside his attorney. Across the room sat Carla Langford, hands clasped tight, knuckles white. Behind her was Detective Naomi Price, standing like a quiet shadow, not to celebrate, but to witness. When the judge asked Wright for his plea, his lawyer stood. "Your Honor, Mr. Wright enters an Alford plea," he said. "He acknowledges the overwhelming evidence, but maintains he never intended harm." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. It wasn't confession. It wasn't innocence. It was a coward's middle ground, a way to admit everything without saying the words that mattered. Carla lowered her head, whispering to herself, "He's still hiding." The prosecution presented the facts first. The DNA evidence, the recovered scarf, the bracelet, the journals, the map. Every photograph was another nail in the coffin of his facade. The defense tried to paint him as a man who'd made a mistake, a moment of passion, a tragic accident. They called him a man haunted by guilt. But guilt wasn't remorse. It was vanity that had gone sour. When the time came for victim statements, Carla walked to the stand. Her voice trembled, but her eyes didn't. "For years," she said, "we looked up to him. He told us to forgive, to move on, to find peace. But what he really meant was stay quiet. He wanted us to forgive what we didn't know he'd done." Her gaze shifted toward him, steady, unflinching. "You sat at her mother's table. You took her father's hand. You turned their grief into your career. You buried her once, and you buried us all with her." No one in the room spoke. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. When she stepped down, Price met her eyes and gave a small nod, one of solidarity, not closure. Justice was coming, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like exhaustion, finally exhaling. When justice finally speaks, does it heal or just remind? The jury didn't deliberate long. After 23 years of silence, the truth didn't need to be argued. It only needed to be spoken aloud. When they returned to the courtroom, the foreman's voice was steady. On all counts, guilty. Evan Wright didn't blink. He simply nodded, his hands folded as if in prayer. Maybe he was pretending it was acceptance. Maybe he was already rewriting the story in his mind. The judge cleared his throat, his words measured, deliberate. "Mr. Wright, you spent decades preaching about grief, about redemption. Yet you denied that same peace to the family of the woman whose life you took. The court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." The gavel fell, once sharp, final. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a closing door. Carla Langford's breath caught in her chest. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She just stared at him, the man who'd stolen a life and hidden it behind applause and sympathy. Detective Naomi Price exhaled slowly. It wasn't relief she felt. It was something quieter, heavier. Justice didn't always feel like victory. Sometimes it felt like the world simply stopping for a moment, just long enough to remember. Afterward, the courtroom emptied, but Price stayed seated. The sunlight stretched across the floorboards, catching the dust in the air. She thought of Diane Mercer, her laughter in those old photographs, her mother's steady voice on the tapes, Carla's relentless loyalty. So many women had carried this case when the system had dropped it. A reporter approached her outside the courthouse steps. "Detective Price," he called. "How does it feel to solve the case that haunted Boulder Ridge for more than 2 decades?" She paused, looking past him toward the horizon, where the mountains stood still as ever. "Science may solve," she said quietly, "but humanity endures." That night, local news replayed the verdict. The story filled every channel, every home. People cried, others shook their heads in disbelief, some refused to believe it at all. But the truth didn't care who believed it. It had waited long enough. When the final coverage ended, a shot of the courthouse lingered on-screen empty hallways, quiet benches, the echo of one last gavel strike, fading into nothing. The gavel didn't close her story. It made sure no one could rewrite it again. The night the university unveiled the plaque, the campus felt older and kinder at once. Students, faculty, townspeople, hundreds gathered on the quad, where Megan's laughter had once been part of the ordinary noise of study groups and late-night coffees. Lanterns hummed like small promises in the cold air. People held photos, letters, scraps of paper with her name written in shaky hands. Carla Langford walked to the front, her pace steady though her chest ached. She carried a restored portrait of Megan, the edges smoothed by gentle fingers, Megan's face bright and defiant in black and white. When Carla set the photo against the memorial stone, there was a hush that felt less like silence and more like respect finally arriving. Speakers took the podium: the university president, a former professor who had supported reopening the case, and Detective Naomi Price. They spoke not of sensational headlines or court battles, but of the cost of forgetting and the responsibility of memory. "We failed," one speaker said plainly. "We failed her family, and we failed the promise we make to each other to protect the vulnerable. Tonight, we try to honor what we did wrong by doing right." A choir of students sang a simple hymn Megan had loved. The melody moved through the crowd, catching breaths and steadying hands. Lanterns were lit and passed, each flame carried like an answer to a long question. People read aloud Megan's lines from an old diary, small, ordinary moments she'd written about. A favorite alley of winter lights, a joke with a friend, the way she studied poetry until dawn. Those small things softened the hard edges of the story and made it human again. At the edge of the gathering, former classmates kept their heads bowed. Some wept openly. Some gripped hands until their knuckles whitened. Students who had been too young to remember Megan's disappearance stood beside those who had been there the year she vanished. The generations bridged themselves with grief and with promise. Carla stepped forward last, placing a single candle at the base of the plaque. She did not give a speech. She did not need to. Her voice, when it came, was a low, steady thing that reached everyone anyway. "We kept searching because she mattered," she said. "We kept looking because a mother refused to let the world forget her child." When the lanterns finally dimmed and people drifted away into the night, the plaque remained a small, stubborn light on the campus wall. It would not change what had been taken, but it would make sure the name Megan Langford stayed present in conversations and in classrooms. It would stand as a quiet command that her life be measured not by the cruelty that ended it, but by the stubborn love that refused to surrender. The university announced a scholarship in Megan's name the following month, a fund for students studying literature and community advocacy. It was more than a gesture. It was a structural promise that future voices would rise in her honor. Carla and Janet's names were engraved on the certificate board beside Megan's portrait when the first recipient was announced. A young woman who dreamed of teaching and of keeping fragile stories alive. Detective Naomi Price received recognition as well. State officials praised the cold case unit's persistence and the scientific methods that had made solving the case possible. Price accepted the award quietly, her thanks brief. She kept thinking of all the people who'd refused to let the file be buried, the volunteers, the archivists, the analyst who'd paused over a faded box, and she used her platform to push for resources so other forgotten cases could get the same second look. In classrooms, professors taught with Megan's story woven into lessons about ethics, forensics, and community responsibility. Her case became a cautionary module: how institutions respond, how public pressure warps investigations, and how new tools can rewrite old endings. Students debated what justice meant when spoken decades later, and they learned the importance of asking hard questions even when it hurts the image of respected figures. Carla kept busy in ways that felt both practical and holy. She worked with campus groups to set up listening sessions for families affected by missing persons, trained volunteers to help preserve cold case evidence, and lobbied for transparent protocols when universities interact with police investigations. She met parents, students, and detectives from other towns, and in every conversation she carried Megan's restored photo folded inside her coat like a talisman. Community healing didn't come all at once. there were still those who refused to accept what had happened, who insisted the verdict was wrong or the system had been manipulated. There were nights Carla found herself exhausted, turning the events over in her head until dawn. But there were also mornings when a student would stop her on campus to say, "Thank you for not giving up." And that small recognition helped the days pull toward light. On the first anniversary of the conviction, candles were lit at the plaque. The scholarship awarded its second student that spring. Detective Price gave a guest lecture about the intersection of science and justice, and she closed by reminding the room that truth often depends on perseverance as much as on technology. "We owe the missing more than answers," she said. "We owe them our memory and our effort." Carla visited Megan's portrait often. She would sit on a nearby bench, telling stories out loud about the girl who loved late-night poetry and gumdrops from the campus store. She talked until her voice grew hoarse, until she felt lighter. The work of remembrance became a kind of life-sustaining ritual, an action against erasure. Months turned into seasons. The campus changed its paths and planted new trees. But when students walked beneath the branches and passed Megan's plaque, they would pause. Some read the inscription aloud. Some lingered to press a hand to the stone. The small acts kept her present. When the documentary crews called, Carla declined interviews. "This isn't about spectacle," she said. "It's about a life, and the duty we have to remember it." She continued to meet with families in support groups, to lobby for better evidence preservation, and to make sure laws reflected the needs of those left waiting. The story of Megan Langford settled into the town the way truth eventually does, not as noise, but as a part of the map. Her name became a shorthand for persistence, for the danger of misplaced trust, and for the quiet power of people who refuse to let a story die. In a city of thousands, one young woman refused to be forgotten, and because she held on, so did justice.